VoyMonk Video Voice Vlog. This is Friday. That's right, Friday vlog. I think if I had a budget and knew what I was doing, maybe I'd have some kind of sound effect or something like that for that. But yeah, this week is leading up to me basically doing what I'm doing here, which is talking about comedy. And I think it's important to, make notes of certain things as far as me going along and doing these video voice vlogs and making the points that I make. Like when I made mention that I'm not saying that I'm the arbiter or I know all of what comedy is and what it should or shouldn't be. I'm definitely not. I am 46 years old, 47, just turned 47. That doesn't mean that my expectations of what something should or should be is correct. I do appreciate the fact that sometimes some things wear more than one hat. People wear more than one hat and do more than one thing. Like I said, I don't get to determine what comedy should or should not be, but I can tell you what the tradition means and what my expectations have been based on that. That being said, I think that there is a lot of comedy now, or a lot of things that pass as comedy, which I'm not necessarily sure that they are. I also understand that when people think about relating to material, keep in mind, me being 47 years old, I don't necessarily get certain things, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. It just means that they may have reached a certain point which it doesn't necessarily feel like the same language to me. And, I think sometimes what people can kind of get away from is the actual material, the content, the substance of something. Changing something too soon and progressing too quickly and trying to get away from labels and, the definition of what things are can sometimes lead situations to being where it's just a mess. There's no order. It's chaotic. Not necessarily mean that that's a totally bad thing, but if you take the time to, cut the carrots and cook the meat and make the soup, it's like if you can't actually taste it, if the ingredients that are being put in there don't actually have anything to do with enhancing the flavor or, making sure that those who are consuming it know what it is, then I'm not necessarily seeing that as a great thing. However, if comedy, like anything else, is beholden and tethered to restrictions and tradition and ideas that maybe don't exist anymore, or they don't apply or mean the same thing, well then, really it's like it's just recycling the same thing over and over. And, maybe some people say there's a time and a place, and maybe some people don't necessarily enjoy comedy all the time, and some people like it all the time. Not all things for all people. And, sometimes people really, need to pick where it is that they lean into. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's all good or all bad, at least in my opinion. It just means that, sometimes that is, the camel that you get, right? That's the horse you rode in on. I do see, like I said, comedy evolving to a degree, but I think sometimes what gets, seems to be, called comedy is really just, for lack of a better word, lack of originality or actual talent. So therefore, it behooves a situation to say, well, it isn't this or it isn't that. But at the same time, it can't honestly be defined for anything. So, like I said, I'm a big comedy fan, but whether it's old comedy, new comedy, current comedy, I have my biases. I have things that I like, and I'll have things that I definitely dislike. But I do believe I know what comedy is based on that 47 years of experience. And so, I think one of the things that I kind of, how do I put this? I've lived 47 years, so I've got to see some great stuff, and I know through the years that due to perception, just like a lot of things, and I've mentioned the thing about courage, right? Beauty and courage. I think one of the things about comedy is that it takes an incredible amount of courage to literally stand up there and do things and blaze new trails and make new ways and discover and find ways to connect with other people in ways that maybe they don't know or they can't find or define the courage to do the very thing that someone might be successful at, like a George Carlin, like a Lenny Bruce, or like Richard Pryor, or a Eddie Murphy. I was gonna say Bill Cosby, but yeah, Bill Cosby was a great comedian as well, and so there are things about that like I said, not all things for all people. Some people, at one point say, Cosby is a family-oriented comedian and he's funny and he doesn't use vulgarity and all that kind of stuff. And if you've ever seen Raw with Eddie Murphy, you'll probably know the context of what I might say, what I could say next. But yeah, but I think in terms of any medium, like I said, whether it's comedy or anything like that, I think there are definitely those who feel like they get to define what it is and that sort of thing. I think if I had to point specifically, I liked Carlin a lot. His material was ahead of its time in many respects, but I think a lot of the people that were the marks for that comedy, oftentimes, as much as they revere, don't actually get quite as much as they think they do. Because I think as much as, comedy can be transformative, I think it's possible, just like with any other art, for people to entirely miss the point. I specifically remember talking to my mom about, she was born in like 1950, right? 1951. And so she's been through a lot more than me, and she's experienced, art and entertainment in a different way as well. And, one of the things I think is actually quite interesting was we were talking specifically about the Prince biopic and the fact that I guess the family put the kibosh on it because they didn't, for whatever reason, creatively feel as though it suited, how they wanted to represent Prince. And the thing of it is, growing up in Minnesota, and I knew a lot of people that absolutely used to party out at Paisley Park, used to dance for Prince, knew very much about Prince. And I'm not going to say anything good or bad because that's not what we do here, not to mention the fact that he has passed away. But the thing is that there's been biopics that have been made, Johnny Cash being one specifically I remembered. He did quite a bit. And then, of course, there is Elvis had one that was more recent. But the thing of it is that, and like I said, I don't necessarily, just like with comedy, I don't necessarily point this to just those who perform something, but as much as it is the way something is consumed, right? Oftentimes if you do research enough with artists, you'll actually find when people kind of do a little bit of a deep dive to try to find out meaning and purpose behind certain songs or whatever, just like his comedy routines and stuff, people can sometimes take concepts or ideas not just individually, but as groups, and just run away with it. Despite what its intention may have ever meant, or if it meant anything at all, despite, its delivery or its package. The fact is that people will oftentimes presume, because that's the way human beings are conditioned. And, you could say maybe it's not the condition, that's just our natural instinct, but I think it may be a bit of both. But the point that I'm making is that, like, going with the Prince biopic, there were some people that were absolutely, and in fandoms you have this, I hate to use labels in this particular way, but you have fans and then you have fanatics. You have people that appreciate the art and the artwork and literally follow it because they like what is being made more than just for what it's being sold as. And then you have people who are fanatics that, despite whatever it's being sold as, they completely reimagine or imagine an entire different world beyond that. And so when it came to Prince, I'm trying to take nothing away from him. But I think what was kind of interesting is a lot of people that I knew, they had completely different takes on Prince as a man and a human being and as an artist than maybe what was actually there and what the reality is. Like I said, and I'm not talking down about Prince or anything like that, but he was a human being, warts and all. He had the same problems, going in and out of life as anybody else would. The thing of it is, though, is that, some people, I'm not using labels or whatever. They felt a very spiritual connection to Prince from almost his very inception until he died. But the truth of the matter is that some of these people that consider themselves fans, or even, some people that might even be considered fanatics, they probably don't know nearly as much as they may pretend to know in reality. Because the truth of the matter is that, Prince was a human being, right? And he lived his life a certain way. And I'm not trying to pick on just Prince. Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley, George Carlin. They produced material. But the thing of it is that for all the stuff that they do that gets recognition, their number one hits, and the things that are knocked out of the park, there are lots of other things that just get left on the table or don't make it there at all, that people either don't pay attention to, don't research and look up, or don't even care about at all. And these are people that sometimes will coin themselves fans or fanatics. So my overall point is that, there's the optics ideas and, the sometimes illusion of something, and then there's that reality. One of the things about Prince specifically, and I thought this was kind of interesting after his death, is that he really was vehemently against having his work on YouTube at all. Like, that was something that he didn't really appreciate. In fact, if you do enough research on YouTube or anywhere else, you'll actually find that anywhere at any time that someone would upload any of his material, there were interesting things that would happen as a result of it, because he really, really did not want, he really didn't like the internet and what it really meant, not only for his music, but for the experience overall. When people talk about Prince, like Purple Rain or Little Red Corvette, or some of his earliest material, right? Those songs were attached to LPs and records that oftentimes had songs that many, even some of the most ardent fans, have never really even consumed. They've never even heard of, right? They don't even listen to. I'm not talking about the songs that may have gotten pushed by the studio or the record label because they felt something would be a number one hit. There's even material that never even made it onto an album. And when it came to Prince, his idea was that when you bought an album, it wasn't just a singular song, which is what usually a record label or a company would produce and push. The entire album that you would later then go ahead and buy was supposed to be an entire experience. So in part, at least from what I gained based on interviews and what he had said himself, that he didn't necessarily like the way that music was consumed, on top of the fact, Napster, the fact that he felt people didn't necessarily always pay the artists what they were supposed to be getting. And of course, the record labels, obviously didn't compensate as well as much as they should for those who produced, made, and created the music, which he himself did. A genius level of that, whatever. But the point is that, like I said, he's a human being, he's a man, and he had his contentions. And unfortunately, going back to what I said, what I thought was interesting and unfortunate after he passed, is that almost as soon as shortly after his funeral, his material eventually became widely available on YouTube, and it seemed like platforms and ways I don't necessarily know that he would have appreciated. And my entire point of this is that, like I said, this was an entire human being. The artist, the human being, anything and all things that were attached to that name, Prince, right? And so, like I said, if you can use that as an example of what I mean, as far as whether it be Lenny Bruce or, like I said, Richard Pryor or George Carlin, like I said, this is, to me, I see it as art. It is a form of expression, which, good or bad, critic, love or hate, that's what it is. But I would say in masses, no matter how popular, I even made a mention about Cindy Crawford and how beautiful she is and was, and what the courage of that meant. I could tie that into what I'm saying here, which is perception is quite a bit, but the essence, the meat, the material, the reality doesn't necessarily always fit that mold. It doesn't always fit the perceptions, and even the experts, even people who are considered, aficionados or really, a Prince, geniuses or something like that, or, George Carlin fanatics and stuff. They can many times miss the boat on the very things that, sometimes they claim to be part of. And like I said, that's not an indictment. That's not, I'm not particularly naming or trying to categorize groups of people or any individual. I'm talking about human condition, consuming content, consuming art, participating in the thing that I'm talking about, which is, like I said, I'm talking about this week what my favorite comedy, and I believe what comedy is, and how it resonates and maybe how it doesn't. And mostly is whittled down to an experience. It's not about, like I said, me pontificating and telling you that I'm right about this or the other thing. I'm just simply suggesting that, perspective oftentimes really doesn't get the recognition that it should be appreciated for. Because as I said before, sometimes people, especially when it comes to generational, almost anything, it's like, it was better way back then. I succinctly remember back in the 80s and 90s hearing the exact same arguments to a T. I remember the exact same kinds of distinctions that were made and, traditions and history that was challenged. And it's kind of interesting how, socially things have kind of morphed into the same place that we were 20, 30 years ago. And not a lot has changed in terms of that argument, at its core, at its meat. But, obviously technology and things around have changed in that, but for better or good, it's different. It's something else. So, like I said, as far as comedy is concerned, me myself, I don't necessarily hold myself into a situation where I expect not to be surprised. But at the same time, I have enough experience to go, you know what? I don't need to be surprised. Or I don't care about being surprised. And, I would say probably for someone that maybe is younger, that sounds, oh my God, so terrible. And like I said, 47 years, there's obviously people much older than me that have absolutely different takes and perspectives. Me, I'm definitely, I definitely like to have new experiences, but in the 47 years that I've learned and gotten to know myself a lot better than I did when I was, 20, 30 years ago, there are just some things that, I don't need to go on the ride to know, whether or not I want to take that trip. And, there's lots of different trips. There's definitely lots of different journeys. There's definitely lots of different experiences, but I don't think that we're all in the same place either. And so when I talk about that perspective, that goes into it as well. Like I said, I was talking to my mom, like I said, about the Prince biopic. I suggested to her that I thought that the reason they probably didn't want to release it is because, quite frankly, depending on how it actually turned out, it's very possible and likely that the people that maybe love him, maybe fanaticize about him, if it was more true to the world that he lived in, they may not necessarily feel the exact same way going forward about, Prince as they did before they went in. And, maybe they would challenge or disbelieve some of the things that were about it. And maybe it didn't necessarily match up to the reality. Who knows? But just like Elvis, just like sometimes a lot of great artists post-mortem, I think a good deal of the mystique and the enterprise that lasts after they've passed away in their legacy is sustained many times by myth, many times by legends and tales, whether they be true or not. Sometimes that's for the good. Sometimes, it's not for the better. Who's to say, I guess, on those specifics. But I said to my mom, I'm like, I'm guessing maybe, because I don't know who owns the estate. I think his sister does now. I could be wrong about that. Or it might be, it might have went back to Warner Brothers as far as his catalog and some of the stuff, whatever. I do not know. But like I said, whomever it is, that might have called that and that, it could have been for a business and financial reasons. Although, to be honest, I also mentioned that, well, like I said, Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley had done a biopic, but, like I said, when it came to Johnny Cash, I think him being revered and Elvis being revered were kind of two different things. And I did see the Johnny Cash biopic. I did not see the Elvis Presley one. So I don't know how they held up against those preconceived notions, good or bad or whatever. So, but when it comes to comedy, I kind of feel the same way. I mean, Richard Pryor, George Carlin, and that kind of thing. I think there's a lot of that can be applied towards them as well. I would like to see a biopic of Richard Pryor or George Carlin. I've kind of heard that they're worked on at least one of those, but I have not seen it. And you know what? It's possible maybe I wouldn't even want to. I wasn't a huge Richard Pryor fan, so I don't know that it would matter. I know that he actually did do some of his own biopic, information about his life when he was alive, but I don't know how that would ultimately translate today after his passing for a number of years. But yeah, kind of got onto a little bit of a rant this Friday, but like I said, I think that pretty much, steps into what I wanted to do in terms of talking about comedy, what my favorite comedians were and are, and how I feel about, the content, whether it's online or specifically the genre itself. So I hope I did okay. I kind of made up for a bit of midweek. And like I said, I don't, sometimes I feel better about certain things than other times, but I don't ever want to be phony or fake or not say what's on my mind and, enjoy doing this at the same time. So when I'm listening to it back and, submitting this as content for the channel for others to consume as well, that I'm happy with what I'm doing. So, oh man, I made this a really thick one. So I'm going to do my best to I tried to be a little bit more lighthearted this week. Less content and a little bit more, just engaging my passions. But so there you go. But that's going to do it for this Friday's vlog. Until next time, take care.